It was a cold and foggy night in late autumn of 1870 when a young man named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. James was 20 years old, and he was currently studying to become a physician at Harvard Medical School. He was a highly logical person, someone who believed that science could explain everything in the universe. To him, the world was a collection of facts, and he had no interest in stories about ghosts, magic, or anything supernatural. Walking beside him was his classmate, William, who was carrying an unlit brass lantern in his hand. The two young men walked quickly, their heads ducked down against the freezing wind that blew off the nearby river. They did not talk much, and the only sound on the empty street was the crunch of their heavy boots on the cold gravel. They were heading to the cemetery for a very specific and dangerous reason. They were there to break in the year 1870. Studying medicine was vastly different than it is today. At Harvard Medical School, students were expected to spend long hours in damp, cold basement lecture halls observing demonstrations on human anatomy. The study of the human body required actual specimens, and during this era, obtaining cadavers for dissection was a difficult and often controversial task. This created a dark subculture of grave robbing, where individuals known as resurrectionists would dig up recently buried bodies to sell them to medical schools. James Adams was fully aware of this dark side of his chosen profession, but he tried to distance himself from it. He was a young man of high moral standards, dedicated to the pure pursuit of scientific knowledge. He believed that the human body was the ultimate machine, a complex system of muscles, bones, and organs that operated under strict physical laws. To James, there was no room for spiritual intervention, magic, or miracles in the field of medicine. He spent his days listening to lectures, dissecting specimens, and discussing the latest medical discoveries with his classmate, William. William shared his academic drive, but possessed a more imaginative mind. He was fascinated by the strange and unexplained anomalies of the human condition. While James looked at a patient and saw a series of symptoms to be solved, William often wondered about the mysteries of the mind and the secrets of the soul. Despite their differences in philosophy, they were inseparable, bound by their shared ambition to graduate at the top of their class and establish successful medical practices. But for several months, James and William had been hearing strange rumors about a man named Ephraim Gray. Ephraim had been a reclusive chemist who lived in a large, dark house in the middle of Malden. He had died 20 years earlier in 1850. According to the stories, Ephraim had spent his final years working on a secret chemical formula in his home. Neighbors said that a pungent, bitter smell of sulfur and unknown chemicals would constantly drift from his chimney. The townspeople whispered that Ephraim was trying to create an elixir of immortality, a potion that would allow him to live forever and conquer death. But his experiments clearly did not work, because he died anyway in 1850. However, when he died, his single loyal servant did something very unusual. He went to the local mortician and demanded that Ephraim's body not be embalmed. The servant claimed that even though the elixir had not kept Ephraim alive, it had successfully made his physical body completely immortal. He claimed that the body would never decay, no matter how much time passed. Ephraim Gray's house was a source of constant dread and fascination for the residents of Malden. It was a massive 3-story Victorian home with tall, narrow windows that were always covered by heavy, dark velvet curtains. The paint was peeling, and the gardens were overgrown with weeds and thorny briars. Ephraim had lived there for decades, completely isolated from the community. He was a trained chemist, having studied in Europe before returning to Massachusetts. The townspeople rarely saw him except for occasional glimpses of his pale, thin face staring out from a 3rd-story window. His only connection to the outside world was his loyal servant, an elderly man who wore simple, outdated clothes and never spoke to the neighbors. What intrigued and frightened the townspeople the most was the constant activity within the mansion. At all hours of the day and night, a thick, greasy black smoke would billow from the central chimney. Along with the smoke came an incredibly powerful offensive odor. It was a chemical scent, a mixture of sharp ammonia, sulfur, and sweet organic compounds that drifted across the streets of Malden. Parents would tell their children to hold their breath when walking past the Gray estate, and local dogs would bark frantically at the iron gates. Rumors began to circulate that Ephraim was conducting forbidden experiments. Some believed he was attempting to turn lead into gold, while others whispered that he was searching for a way to achieve physical immortality. When Ephraim died in 1850, the rumor mill went into overdrive. The servant's demand that the body not be embalmed because it was already immortal only fueled the legend. For 20 years, the story of the chemist who defied decay was told around fireplaces and in local taverns. When James and William heard their fellow Harvard students debating the legend, James felt a deep sense of frustration. He believed that allowing such unscientific myths to persist was an insult to the medical profession. He argued that the human body, once dead, must return to the earth. To prove his point, he challenged William to help him break into the mausoleum. This story became a legendary tale in the area, and even some of the students at Harvard Medical School believed there might be some truth to it. They would debate how certain chemicals could preserve human tissue for decades. But James Adams knew this was impossible. He knew that without modern preservation techniques, a human body would decompose within weeks. After 20 years in a tomb, Ephraim Gray's body had to be nothing more than a pile of dry bones. James decided that the only way to put an end to these foolish rumors was to see the body for himself. He convinced William to join him, and tonight, they were going to open the casket. When they reached the cemetery gates, they stopped and stood in the shadows, looking around to make sure nobody was watching. The street was quiet and deserted. They approached the tall iron gate and helped each other climb over the cold bars. Once they landed on the damp grass on the other side, they took off running. They followed the winding gravel path deeper into the cemetery, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that if they were caught, they would be arrested and expelled from medical school, ruining their futures. But their curiosity was too strong to turn back now. They eventually reached the brick mausoleum of the Gray family. It was a small, cold structure covered in creeping ivy. James knelt down in front of the heavy wooden door, and William struck a match to light the lantern. The soft yellow glow illuminated the door, and they saw that it was sealed shut with a heavy padlock. James pulled a small hammer and a sharp metal chisel from his coat pocket. He placed the chisel against the lock and began to strike it. The metallic clicks seemed incredibly loud in the absolute silence of the graveyard. James kept stopping to listen, terrified that a watchman would hear them, but the cemetery remained quiet. With one final hard strike, the rusted padlock snapped open. James set the lock on the ground, and he and William pushed the heavy door open. They stepped inside the tomb. The air was freezing and musty, smelling of damp earth and old stone. The interior was covered in thick cobwebs. Along the walls were stone shelves, each holding a dark wooden casket containing the remains of Ephraim's relatives. They walked down the aisle, reading the dusty metal nameplates until they found the casket they were looking for. It was labeled Ephraim Gray. James and William stood on either side of the casket. Together, they carefully slid the heavy wooden box off the shelf and lowered it to the stone floor. James's hands were shaking as he reached down and gripped the edge of the lid. He looked at William, who held the lantern close to illuminate the casket. James took a deep breath and pulled the lid open. What they saw inside left them completely frozen in terror. They expected to see a skeleton, but instead they were staring at a perfectly preserved body. Ephraim's fine wool clothing had decayed over the past 20 years into a stringy dark mush that lay around him, but his body was completely intact. His skin was smooth and white, with absolutely no signs of decomposition. He looked as though he was simply sleeping, and his face was pristine. It looked like he could open his eyes at any moment. The sight was so impossible and terrifying that James and William instantly slammed the casket lid shut. They did not even bother to put the casket back on the shelf. They turned and sprinted out of the mausoleum, running as fast as they could through the dark cemetery. They climbed back over the iron gate and fled into the night. They ran back to their rooms and made a solemn promise never to speak of what they had seen to anyone. For the next few months, James was haunted by the image of the pristine body. He spent hours in the Harvard Library reading every chemistry book he could find, searching for a logical explanation. He also lived in constant fear of the police, knowing that grave robbing was a serious crime. But as the weeks turned into months, no police ever showed up, and he eventually graduated and moved to Boston to start his own medical practice. The memory of that night faded, becoming a distant, bizarre secret 30 years past. James was now in his 50s, a successful and highly respected doctor in Boston. One afternoon, while working in his private office, he heard a firm knock on his door. A police officer from the Malden department entered. The officer explained that they were investigating an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years ago. James felt a wave of panic and was about to lie, but the officer stopped him, saying that several townspeople had recently identified him and William as the ones responsible. James knew there was no point in denying it. He confessed, explaining that it was a foolish student prank to see if the rumors of the immortal chemist were true. He swore they only looked at the body and left it exactly as it was. But the officer's face remained grim. He explained that the Malden cemetery was being relocated and workers were moving all the graves. When they opened Ephraim Gray's casket, it was completely empty. There was no body, no bones, nothing. And there was no evidence that anyone else had ever tampered with the tomb since James and William's break-in. James was left in shock. If they hadn't taken the body and no one else has entered, where did Ephraim Gray go? He couldn't help but wonder if the chemist's immortality elixir had actually worked, and he had simply woken up and walked out of his tomb. Now let us move to the second story, which takes place on the afternoon of January 28, 1945. An Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a hard wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. The tropical summer heat was intense, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Robert was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, Standing in front of a heavy locked door were these two people, these two psychic mediums who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. The reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. There was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually appendix removal was a routine surgery and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But this operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Luis Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do this surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. Robert Cheney was not a man who was easily impressed. As an experienced investigative journalist, he had traveled to many different countries, uncovering political scandals, exposing fraudulent spiritualists, and writing about the strange and unusual. He had seen stage magicians perform seemingly impossible illusions, and he knew that with enough preparation, anyone could be deceived. When he first heard about the spiritual surgeries of Dr. Luis Gomes in Brazil, his immediate reaction was one of complete disbelief. He was convinced that this was a clever theatrical performance designed to exploit the hopes of desperate, sick people. He decided to attend the surgery with a critical eye, determined to document the exact methods used to perpetrate the fraud. The local Brazilian medical community was equally outraged by the claims. Several prominent doctors had publicly condemned the spiritualists, calling them dangerous charlatans who were putting lives at risk. They argued that performing surgical procedures in a non-sterile environment without anesthesia and without proper medical training was a recipe for infection and death. To put an end to the controversy, these doctors had demanded to be present during the operation as official witnesses, bringing along their own medical equipment to examine the patient before and after the procedure. They were joined by Robert Cheney, who wanted to capture every detail for his newspaper article. So, first it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room. So that backlocked room while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists, nobody. And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him. They'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room. And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room. And then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked, and then the instructions had been given to Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there sort of listening and watching and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor. But the whole thing was just sort of absurd, and honestly Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was going to be this totally bizarre procedure done, he had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this along the pew with him talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to mention the doctors are also saying that generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he just started to feel like this whole thing was really unsettling. Like now it's just creepy, the sound of the hymn and the mediums writhing around, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door, and it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for like 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert at this point looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we going to see in there? But they had waited this long. They really wanted to see. So they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're going to see what's inside of this operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around, and at first it was just really weird, like there was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table, he has fresh stitches right on his side suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid. The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this had happened. Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in after the surgery. Nobody came out. Even though they swore basically that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost. Our third story begins on the morning of December 5th, 1957. A 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California, and before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense that somebody else was in the room with her. But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Jean. So, Jean was 82 years old, and he'd been really sick for the past couple of years, and recently he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom. So he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. But then in the mornings he would often come and join her in bed, and so she's assuming that's what's going on. Jean must have joined me in the middle of the night, and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Jean. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed looking outward, and her perspective from her head, the way she was positioned is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Jean, because Jean did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know, and as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed. And she looked at this guy, and he leaned forward, and he just kind of continued to smile. And he said, "I'm here for Jean." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh. And then, to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Jean burst in asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Jean all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Jean's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking you were having a dream. Clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Jean, she was starting to think that maybe she had had like a very lucid, vivid dream. However, just to be safe, Frances and Jean spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and also looking for any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Jean did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing, but other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Jean, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened. And they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe. And so by 7 o'clock that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in her room with blue eyes, and this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Jean really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever. Jean starts falling apart to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You got to come here right now. Something is wrong with Jean. He is falling apart here." By 8 o'clock, when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know, but this is an hour later. The doctor shows up, and by this point, Jean is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed, he's falling apart, he gets rushed to the hospital. And all day that day, they're trying to save him, but by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Jean's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision, and so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Jean's death. However, despite telling herself the story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe. She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So, how did her mind come up with this really vivid character, but she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience? Well, that is until a few months later, late one night in the spring of 1958. So, a few months after Jean's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Jean's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Jean's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes who was looking right at her and grinning. And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it. And she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Jean. But on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. So for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, like what they thought it meant. And then at some point towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, "Yeah, and then right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Jean. And then your dad died 24 hours later." And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet. And she looks at her mom and she's like, "That's not what he said to me." And Frances is like, "What do you mean? Like, what did he say to you?" And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, "He said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me." For a moment, the car just went totally quiet and neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, "Well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Jean. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Jean died." And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame, that I know he said, "I'm here for Jean." And you think he said, "I'm here for Jane." But you're still alive. And that was months ago. You must have just misheard him. He must have said, "I'm here for Jean," same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience. And in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Jean. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year, and one day after Jean died, Frances's daughter Jane died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy, as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up, but had gone undetected. And now, by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like we got to tell people about this, like what happened. And she even ended up writing to a journalist to try to get the story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. Following the tragic and sudden death of her daughter Jane, Frances was consumed by an overwhelming sense of grief and curiosity. She could not accept that the appearance of the strange little man was a mere coincidence. She began to spend all her time researching the history of spiritualism, apparitions, and local folklore. She wrote letters to prominent paranormal researchers and journalists across the country, describing the exact sequence of events that had occurred on the morning of December 5, 1957. She described the man's physical appearance in meticulous detail, focusing on his distinctive clothing, the highly polished black shoes, the gray fabric spats buttoned over his ankles, the black and gray striped trousers, the white vest, and the long black coat with formal coattails. Eventually, her letters caught the attention of a local historian who specialized in 19th century social customs and mourning rituals. The historian met with Frances in her home, listening patiently as she retold the story of her encounters. When she finished, the historian smiled gently and explained that the man's outfit was not a random collection of antique clothes. He revealed that in the late 1800s, professional undertakers and funeral directors wore a very specific, formal uniform when preparing bodies and directing funeral services. This uniform consisted of striped trousers, a white vest, a long black coat with coattails, and polished dress shoes with spats. The outfit was designed to project an air of solemn respectability and authority. The historian pointed out that the little man with the piercing blue eyes and the mocking grin was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. This revelation sent a chill down Frances's spine. It suggested that the entity she and her daughter had witnessed was not a simple ghost, but a personification of death itself, an undertaker from the spirit world who had arrived to collect the souls of her loved ones. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.